Most shipwrecks are found. These ones never needed finding. They are sitting right there, in broad daylight, visible from the beach. Some of them shallow enough to wade to. A concrete steamship sitting in 15 feet of water off the Bahamas. A Civil War ironclad that spent 102 years buried in a river before anyone remembered to go looking for it. A wooden fishing boat that burned on a sandbar while someone live-streamed it on social media. A former Soviet military vessel that a Category 4 hurricane dragged 12 miles across a Caribbean sandbank and just left there like a receipt nobody wants to deal with. All of them still there. All of them in water shallow enough to swim in. None of them going anywhere. The usual answer when someone asks why a shipwreck is still on the bottom is depth. Too far down to reach. Too expensive to recover. Beyond the reach of any human diver. There are submarines sitting 5,000 feet down in the Gulf of Mexico where the pressure alone would turn a submersible into modern sculpture. The answer there is simple: too deep. None of that applies here. These wrecks are not deep. They are not remote. They are not beyond the reach of ordinary salvage operations. Some of them are literal tourist attractions. People take jet ski tours to them. You can see one of them on Google Maps right now. And yet there they sit. Rusting, rotting, growing coral, growing mangroves, growing everything except any serious plan to move them. So the question is the same as it always is, just with a different answer. Why are they still there? That question has an answer. It is not the answer you would expect. And it is not the same answer for any two of them. 6 wrecks, 6 stories. Let's find out. The SS Point Reyes did not sink during a storm. It did not hit a reef. It did not succumb to torpedo fire or mechanical failure or any of the dramatic exits from maritime service that tend to end up on channels like this one. It ran aground during a failed tow across a bay and was simply left there. That is the entire origin story. Someone was towing it. It got stuck. Nobody came back. The boat itself was built in 1944 as a military launch. A wooden-hulled purse seiner in the classic Monterey style, designed to ferry soldiers and equipment between aircraft carriers and San Francisco Bay ports during the final years of World War II. After the war, it was sold into commercial fishing service, spent decades working the salmon runs of Tamales Bay under a fisherman named Merrill Rocker Sr., and eventually ended up purchased by a local resident who wanted to restore it. That restoration never happened. While being towed across Tamales Bay, the boat ran aground on a sandbar behind the Inverness store and Dixon Marine Services. The tow operator appears to have made a decision that can only be described as optimistic: leave it there and sort it out later. Later never came. The mudflat it settled onto sits at the edge of the Point Reyes National Seashore, about 40 miles northwest of the Golden Gate Bridge. Federal land, jurisdiction of the National Park Service. And there the boat sat through the 1990s, into the 2000s, gradually doing what wooden boats do when nobody is looking after them. It deteriorated. The hull began to split. The wood began to gray. The arcing bow, which had been one of the defining visual features of the Monterey fishing boat design, that distinctive curved prow that cuts into the waterline, took on the sculpted quality that weathered wood develops over time. Beautiful in a melancholy sort of way. Photogenic, and that, unfortunately, is where the story takes its first turn. Photographers found it. And once photographers find something, the logic of the internet takes over. By the early 2000s, the Point Reyes had become a minor landmark. Dixon Marine Services, a wetlands restoration firm run by Rebecca Dixon and her husband Mark Sutton, announced plans to remove the vessel and restore the natural mudflat habitat. Straightforward enough. Old rotting boat, sensitive ecological zone. Remove the boat, restore the habitat. Except the internet objected. A coalition of local photographers, tourists, and enthusiasts petitioned to keep the vessel exactly where it was. Their argument, to summarize: it looks good. The National Park Service, apparently persuaded by this, relented. The boat stayed. A small walking trail was established to the site. This was a decision that would eventually become one of the stranger footnotes in the history of American heritage management. Before we go any further, quick question for the comment section. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your location below. Always genuinely curious how far this channel reaches. Back to California. And this is where the Point Reyes story stops being melancholy and starts being darkly farcical. On the night of February 22nd, 2016, a photographer climbed down to the Point Reyes wreck with a specific creative goal in mind: long exposure photography. Steel wool. The technique involves spinning burning steel wool in front of a camera with a long shutter speed, creating photographs where the sparks trail into golden arcs of light against a dark background. Striking visual effect, very popular in certain photography communities. The technique requires you to set something on fire near whatever you are trying to photograph. On a dry, weathered, 60-year-old wooden boat, on a sandbar, in a national seashore. The spark landed, the wood caught. The fire spread quickly enough that someone live-streamed it on social media before the fire department could respond. By the time it was out, the entire stern of the SS Point Reyes was destroyed, burned to charred timber and ash, collapsing into the mudflat. Inverness Fire Chief Jim Fox publicly called for the removal of the wreck following the fire. The California State Lands Commission applied for a federal grant in 2022 to have it cleared from the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. The grant application failed. The boat stayed. What the fire started, winter storms finished. By early 2024, a powerful atmospheric river hit the California coast, and the remaining hull collapsed completely. One half fell off entirely. The other leaned until it gave out. The arcing bow that had been the signature of the whole site, the feature that had generated thousands of photographs and enough petitions to block a removal order, was reduced to a pile of rotting planks in the mud, scattered with rusty nails and spray paint from tourists who had been using it as a canvas for years. The SS Point Reyes is still there because photographers saved it, and then burned it down. And then nobody wanted to deal with the cleanup. The mudflat is federal land. The cost of removal falls on nobody with a strong enough incentive to actually do it. So it sits. Occasionally a storm moves the debris around. The nails rust, the graffiti fades. That is the complete and specific answer to why the Point Reyes is still there. Because the people who saved it from being removed also destroyed it, and the people responsible for the land it sits on have not yet gotten around to cleaning up the aftermath. The Sweepstakes is a two-masted wooden schooner that sank in 1885. It is currently one of the most structurally intact 19th century wooden vessels in North America. Those two facts sit in tension with each other in a way that takes a moment to process. A wooden boat that is 140 years old should, by all reasonable expectations, be gone. Wood rots. Salt water destroys it faster. There is an organism called Teredo nivalis, the shipworm, that will eat an unprotected wooden hull in open ocean to near nothing within a matter of years. The history of wooden shipwrecks in saltwater is essentially a history of accelerating disintegration. The Sweepstakes is in freshwater. That single variable changes everything. Lake Huron's cold freshwater lacks the dissolved salts that drive galvanic corrosion in metals and accelerate wood decay in marine environments. The low water temperatures reduce the metabolic rate of wood-rotting organisms to a near standstill. And critically, Teredo nivalis does not survive in freshwater. The organism that turns wooden hulls into Swiss cheese in the ocean simply cannot exist in Lake Huron. The result, a wooden schooner built in Burlington, Ontario, in 1867 is still sitting on the bottom of Big Tub Harbour in recognizable, largely intact condition. The Sweepstakes measured 119 feet 1 inch in length, a beam of 23 feet, and a depth of hold of 10 feet. It registered at 218 gross tons. For the last 2 decades of its working life, it hauled essential bulk cargo across the Great Lakes, coal, lumber, grain, under the ownership of a man named George Stewart of Moretown, Ontario. Hard, unglamorous, economically vital work. In August 1885, the schooner struck a submerged rock reef off Cove Island, sustaining critical hull damage. The damaged vessel was towed by the steam tugboat Jessie into the sheltered waters of Big Tub Harbour, a deep, calm, natural basin that had historically been used as a refuge for damaged ships. The crew assessed the damage. The structural damage to the wooden hull was beyond repair. The Sweepstakes was abandoned. In September 1885, it settled upright onto the harbour floor. The depth at the bow, 20 feet, about 6 meters. 50 yards from the head of the harbor. Salvage teams arrived and successfully retrieved the cargo of coal. The wooden superstructure, the deck fittings, the masts, all of it was left in place. There was no compelling economic reason to spend money recovering timber that was worth less than the cost of recovery. What those salvage teams left behind, freshwater and cold temperatures preserved. Today the wreck lies exactly as it settled 140 years ago. The bow remains in excellent condition, preserving the original windlass and substantial sections of the starboard railings. Amidships, the wooden centerboard box, the structural housing that runs from the keel to the deck, containing the retractable centerboard used to stabilize the vessel in shallow water, is fully visible with the centerboard still inside it. The spatial arrangement of the vessel on the harbor floor is essentially unchanged from the day it went down. The fact that it has survived this long is one thing. The reason it is still there, meaning the reason nobody has removed it or salvaged it, is straightforward. It sits within Fathom 5 National Marine Park, designated in 1987. The park encompasses 112 square kilometers of Lake Huron shoreline and underwater landscape around the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario. The Sweepstakes is one of the primary reasons divers from across North America come to Tobermory. Removing it would be equivalent to dismantling an exhibit from a museum to free up floor space. The park authority has instead invested in preserving it. Underwater engineering repairs have placed structural braces to prevent the remaining deck from collapsing under its own weight. Physical barricades inside the hold stop divers from swimming beneath the fragile deck spaces. The tiny pressure differentials from scuba bubbles are apparently enough to accelerate the deterioration of wood this old. The original stern name board was physically removed from the wreck and archived at the Bruce County Museum in Southampton to prevent theft. The Sweepstakes is still there because the water kept it, and now the law protects it. One caveat worth noting: the aft deck did eventually collapse under its own weight, sending the heavy stern post to the harbor floor. Even the best preserved wrecks lose ground to time eventually, but what remains is extraordinary by any standard of 19th century wooden vessel preservation. No fire, no photography, no bureaucratic negligence, just cold water, no salt, no shipworms, and a national park designation. Here is a sentence that sounds like a mistake. The United States government once built a fleet of cargo ships out of concrete, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. Actual concrete ships built under the direct authorization of President Woodrow Wilson during World War I, because the country was running low on structural steel, and someone at the United States Shipping Board had an idea. The material was ferrocement, a dense matrix of steel reinforcement bars encased in poured concrete. The argument for it was not unreasonable: lighter than steel, significantly cheaper to manufacture, highly resistant to fire. The argument against it, which became apparent fairly quickly, was that ferrocement hulls were structurally brittle under impact. As in, hit something hard enough and the hull shatters. The sister ship of the Sapona demonstrated this with catastrophic clarity when it collided with another vessel off Narragansett. The concrete hull, as one contemporary account put it, shattered like a teacup. 19 crew members died. The Sapona avoided that fate. What it got instead was a series of increasingly peculiar chapters that eventually culminated in it being used as a floating liquor warehouse during Prohibition, then bombed by the US military, and then visited by a training flight that subsequently became one of the most famous disappearances in aviation history. The vessel was laid down in 1919 in Wilmington, North Carolina, launched under the name Old North State, renamed Sapona before the end of the year, and delivered on January 14, 1920, at a construction cost of $1,127,705.81. It measured 281 feet 10 inches in length, with a beam of 46 feet and a loaded draft of 23 feet 6 inches, powered by a coal-fired boiler and a triple expansion steam engine producing 1,400 indicated horsepower. Built too late to serve in the war it was designed for, it briefly worked the New England coal trade before being laid up in Virginia. In 1924, a Miami Beach developer named Carl G. Fisher bought it for $4,000 for a concrete steamship that had cost over $1 million to build 4 years earlier. This is either a spectacular deal or a warning sign, depending on your perspective. Fisher stripped the steam machinery out and traded it to a dredging company for dredging services, suggesting he had plans for the hull that did not involve it going anywhere under its own power. He then sold the bare concrete hull to a Nassau-based businessman named Bruce Bethel. Bethel was a liquor merchant. The year was 1924. The United States was 3 years into Prohibition. Bimini, sitting about 50 miles off the coast of Florida, was already one of the primary staging points for rum-running operations into the American market. Bethel towed the Sapona to the shallow waters off South Bimini and deliberately scuttled it in the sand. The plan: use the enormous concrete hull as a stationary floating warehouse for his rum and whiskey stock, a permanent supply depot, anchored in international waters beyond the reach of American federal agents who could not legally operate in Bahamian waters. He earned the title Bimini's Rum King. He apparently also planned to build a luxury casino and nightclub on the concrete deck. The Sapona, as a floating entertainment complex in the middle of the Caribbean, serving drinks to the American wealthy who could not legally get them at home. In 1926, a Category 4 hurricane arrived and ended this business plan comprehensively. The storm ripped the Sapona from its moorings, drove it across the shallow reef of Barnett Harbor, and broke the stern section clean off the vessel. Bethel's entire liquor stock was destroyed. He never recovered financially. He died in 1950. Penniless. The abandoned hull sat in the shallow water, slowly becoming part of the scenery. During World War II, the United States military requisitioned the visible concrete hulk as a target for aerial bombing and strafing practice. By 1945, it had been hit so many times by naval aviation that most of the concrete hull plates had been destroyed, leaving behind a rusted steel reinforcement bar grid rising out of the water like the skeleton of something enormous. Then came December 5, 1945. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, the training flight designated Flight 19, carrying 14 crewmen, departed for a routine navigation exercise. Their route took them directly over the SS Sapona, where they completed a practice bombing run on the wreck. Then they continued on their navigation route. Then the pilots became disoriented in deteriorating weather. Then they vanished. A PBM Mariner search aircraft sent to find them also disappeared. All 14 crew of Flight 19 were never found. Neither was the Mariner or its 13 crew. It was one of the largest peacetime aviation disappearances in American history, and it contributed significantly to the mythology of the Bermuda Triangle. Following this, the United States military ceased using the Sapona as a target. Today the wreck sits in approximately 15 to 20 feet of water, 4 miles south of Bimini. The prow section remains the most structurally sound portion, holding the main concrete deck intact. The stern, compromised during the 1926 grounding and further degraded by hurricane damage across the subsequent decades, collapsed entirely into concrete rubble on the seafloor during the mid to late 2000s. What remains of the steel reinforcement grid is covered in tropical marine life. It appeared as a backdrop in the 1977 horror film Shockwaves. Nobody will ever raise it. There is nothing to raise. The concrete that was not bombed away by the US Navy has been fractured by salt-driven spalling, a process where absorbed chlorides from the seawater cause the internal rebar to rust, expand, and crack the surrounding concrete from the inside out. After 100 years of this, combined with military ordnance, the Sapona is structural rubble covered in coral. The Sapona is still there because the man who owned it went bankrupt. The material it was built from is incompatible with a century of tropical saltwater. And what the hurricane did not destroy, the US Navy finished. The SS City of Adelaide was launched from a shipyard in Govan, Glasgow, on December 22, 1863. It is now a mangrove island. That is not a simple transformation. Between the Glasgow shipyard and the mangrove island in Cockle Bay, Queensland, there were 53 years of active maritime service, 3 complete structural conversions, a coal fire that gutted the interior, an aerial collision that killed 4 men, and the slow geological patience of a tropical tidal flat. The result is a wreck so fully absorbed by its environment that calling it a shipwreck at all requires a degree of conceptual flexibility. The city of Adelaide was built for the Australasian Steam Navigation Company by J&G Thomson of Govan, a firm whose reputation for iron hull construction was well established by the 1860s. The vessel measured 246 feet in length, 28.3 feet in beam, and 16.6 feet in depth, registering at 838 gross tons. a three-masted passenger sail steamer powered by a Thomson-built two-cylinder marine steam engine turning a single screw. For more than 2 decades, it ran vital coastal routes between Melbourne and Sydney, and transoceanic voyages connecting Australia to Honolulu and San Francisco. In 1871, one of the 3 masts was removed during a refit to expand passenger cabin space. In 1887, a corporate merger transferred ownership to the Australasian United Steam Navigation Company. In 1890, the steam engines were removed entirely and 2 new masts were installed, converting the vessel into a 4-masted sailing jackass bark. A passenger liner rebuilt into a sailing cargo vessel. In 1902, the Howard Smith Company of Townsville purchased it, stripped the remaining rigging, and converted it into a stationary coal hulk, a floating storage depot for the coal used to fuel steamships in Townsville Harbour. The city of Adelaide went from a passenger liner that had carried people across the Pacific to a vessel that sat in harbour and held coal. Then the coal caught fire. While the city of Adelaide was serving as a coal storage hulk, the cargo ignited. The fire gutted the interior of the vessel entirely, leaving the iron hull plates structurally intact, but the interior burned out. The hull was now an iron shell. In 1915, a man named George Butler, son of Magnetic Island's first European settler, purchased the burned iron hulk with the intention of scuttling it off Picnic Bay as a breakwater for a passenger jetty. In 1916, while being towed from Townsville across Cockle Bay, the hull ran aground on a shallow sandbar approximately 300 meters from the shoreline. It never moved again. In the 1920s, island residents found a use for the stranded hull. It became a changing room for swimmers and a harvesting site for oysters growing on the iron plates below the waterline. The grounded ship had become furniture. On October 22, 1942, 6 RAAF Bristol Bayfort bombers of Nome 100 Squadron conducted a coordinated practice torpedo attack exercise over Townsville Harbour, followed by a simulated bombing run on the city of Adelaide in Cockle Bay. The bombers approached at approximately 1,000 feet in a tight formation. During a low-altitude diving run, one aircraft, Beaufort A926, miscalculated its altitude. The wing struck the top of the ship's rear iron mast. The bomber disintegrated and crashed into the shallow sea approximately 700 to 800 yards beyond the wreck. All 4 men aboard were killed instantly. The pilot, Flying Officer George Avery, was 24. A United States Navy lieutenant named George Gluck was flying as a passenger to observe RAAF torpedo tactics. He was also killed. On December 24, 1971, Category 4 Cyclone Althea struck the coast of northern Queensland. Major sections of the rusted iron hull collapsed, and then something happened that no one planned for. The remaining iron frame became a sediment trap. Soft tidal sediment accumulated inside the collapsed hull structure. Mangrove propagules, the dense seed pods of Rhizophora mangle, the red mangrove, arrived on tidal currents and settled into that sediment. They germinated, they grew. Over the following decades, salt-tolerant mangrove trees grew directly out of what had been the ship's cargo holds. Their root systems locked into the accumulated sediment and the remaining iron structure. The iron frame became scaffolding for a mangrove colony. Today, the city of Adelaide is a protected maritime heritage site and a functioning ecosystem simultaneously. Mangrove trees grow out of the iron interior. Marine birds, herons, egrets, nest in the branches of trees growing inside what was once a passenger liner. The iron hull plates, what remains of them, are colonized by oysters, barnacles, and intertidal marine organisms. It is integrated into a shipwreck heritage trail around Magnetic Island that documents over 20 known wrecks in the area, including a 3-masted bark from Hamburg wrecked in 1890 and a wooden steamship that ran aground in Picnic Bay in 1901. Why is the city of Adelaide still there? Because by the time anyone considered removing it, it had become a living structure. The mangrove trees that grew inside it are now part of the coastal ecosystem. Removing the iron frame would require removing the mangroves, which would require removing the sediment they are rooted in, which would significantly disturb the intertidal habitat. The wreck has made itself part of the place it sits in. It is by any reasonable definition no longer a wreck. It is terrain. The USS Cairo was the first warship in history to be sunk by a remotely detonated mine. That is its entry in the historical record. The footnote that appears before the specifications, before the service history, before the names of the men who crewed it. December 12, 1862, Yazoo River north of Vicksburg. 2 Confederate mines, wired to volunteers hidden behind the riverbank, detonated in sequence against the hull. The Cairo sank in 12 minutes in 36 feet of water. The entire crew escaped without a single casualty. Then it was forgotten for 94 years. The Cairo was one of 7 City-class casemate ironclad gunboats, designed by naval architect Samuel M. Pook and built by James Eads and Company in Mound City, Illinois in 1861. Because of their broad, squat profile and peculiar silhouette in the water, these vessels were nicknamed Pook Turtles. The Cairo measured 175 feet in length and 51 feet 2 inches in beam, a length-to-beam ratio of 3.4, which is very close to square. They were designed to operate on the shallow Mississippi River and its tributaries, while carrying enough armor and armament to engage shore batteries and Confederate fortifications, to carry heavy iron plating and a large weapons complement while maintaining a draft of only 6 feet. Pook used a broad hull with 3 distinct keels, the outboard pair extending longer than the centerline keel. Propulsion came from a single 22-foot diameter paddle wheel at the aft end of the center keel, protected from enemy fire by the sloping wooden casemate structure. 2 steam engines supplied by 5 fire tube boilers measuring 24 feet long. I want to note here, because I went back and checked this twice. The boilers were originally installed in shallow holds to protect them from incoming fire. This worked for protection but caused the engines to run on a mixture of water and steam rather than steam alone. The fix, moving the steam drums to the top of the boilers, left them fully exposed to enemy fire. They traded one problem for its opposite. The armor was rolled iron plate. The forward casemate and pilot house were protected by 2.5 inches of iron. A 2.5-inch iron belt extended 60 feet along the sides of the machinery spaces. The forward casemate sides were upgraded to 3.5 inches of interlocked railroad iron. The stern and deck were left entirely unarmored. The armament across 13 gun ports included, in its original January 1862 configuration, 3 8-inch smoothbore Dahlgren guns, 6 42-pounder rifles, 6 32-pounder rifles, and 1 12-pounder rifle. The 42-pounder rifles were modified smoothbores that had been converted into rifles, which made them structurally weaker and prone to catastrophic failure. They were known to explode. The Cairo participated in the capture of Fort Pillow in Tennessee, which opened the Mississippi River as far as Memphis. On June 6, 1862, Union naval forces took Memphis. The Cairo was part of that operation. On December 12, 1862, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Thomas O. Selfridge, Jr., the Cairo led a small flotilla up the Yazoo River as part of the Yazoo Pass expedition, tasked with clearing Confederate shore batteries and underwater mines, called torpedoes at the time, from the river in advance of a larger Union offensive against Vicksburg. 2 explosions in rapid succession. The first mine detonated against the port bow, the second along the armored belt on the starboard side. The hits were not survivable. The Cairo sank in 12 minutes. Every man aboard got off the vessel alive. The ironclad settled into the river mud, and the thick silt of the Yazoo River closed over it. By the time the Civil War ended, by the time Reconstruction came and went, by the time the 20th century arrived, the exact location of the Cairo had been forgotten entirely. In 1956, a historian at Vicksburg National Military Park named Edwin C. Bass located the buried hull using a simple magnetic compass. The iron armor, buried in river mud, was generating a detectable magnetic signature. Bass worked with 2 colleagues, Don Jacks and Warren Grabow, to identify the site. In 1960, divers successfully recovered the intact wooden pilot house and an 8-inch Dahlgren cannon from the mud. Here is the part that makes preservation historians wince. In October 1964, a salvage operation was mounted to raise the entire vessel. The method chosen was steel cables, 3-inch diameter steel cables attached to the buried hull and connected to cranes on barges above. This is a standard approach to heavy lift salvage. The problem was that the Cairo had been buried in river mud under anaerobic conditions, without oxygen, since 1862. Anaerobic mud is extraordinarily effective at preservation. The wood had been sealed from oxygen and light for over a century. The waterlogged white oak of the hull was structurally intact, but had the mechanical properties of very wet, very fragile timber. The steel cables, under the immense weight of the mud-laden vessel, cut directly into the waterlogged oak. The wood could not withstand the concentrated load of 3-inch cables under tension. To prevent the complete destruction of the hull, the salvage team made the decision to cut it into 3 sections and raise each section separately. This worked, in the sense that it saved the vessel from being completely destroyed by the cables. Whether cutting a 103-year-old Civil War ironclad into 3 pieces counts as a successful salvage operation depends on your definition of success. The 3 sections were loaded onto barges, towed to the Ingalls shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi, where the iron armor was removed and cleaned, and the steam engines were disassembled. A sprinkler system was installed to prevent the waterlogged timber from warping and splitting as it dried. The wood was internally braced. In 1977, the sections were transported to Vicksburg National Military Park and reconstructed on a concrete foundation. An open-sided canopy was built over the reassembled hull, later upgraded to a high-strength tension fabric cover. The adjacent USS Cairo Museum houses the artifacts recovered from the river mud: ammunition, medical supplies, weapons, a rope knife belonging to one of the sailors who walked off the vessel in December 1862. The anaerobic mud preserved all of it. Leather, wood, paper, organic material, all intact after 102 years in the river. The Cairo is technically no longer a wreck in shallow water. It is on dry land, partially reassembled, under a canopy. But the reason it is still in the condition it is, the reason it survived at all, is the same reason it could not simply be pulled out of the river in one piece. The same mud that preserved it for a century also made it impossible to recover without damage. The Cairo is still here because the mud gave it back, and the cables took something in return. The La Famille Express began its existence as a Soviet military auxiliary vessel named the Fort Shevchenko, named after the strategic military port on the eastern shore of the Caspian Sea in Kazakhstan. Built in 1952 in Poland or the Soviet Union, it was designed to service remote offshore oil rigs for the Soviet Navy, carrying heavy supplies and equipment through the cold waters of the Caspian and Baltic Seas. It reportedly witnessed the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Fort Shevchenko was decommissioned in 1992. For approximately 10 years it operated various commercial functions in the Baltic. In 1999, it was purchased by a Panamanian shipping company, renamed La Famille Express, and registered under the Panama flag. The ship was brought to the Caribbean to operate as a regional freighter. By this point, the vessel was in poor condition. It had not been well maintained. The structural age of the ship made it unsuitable for carrying anything particularly valuable. It was relegated to hauling bulk rock and construction materials between Caribbean ports. This is the bottom rung of commercial freight operations. You do not put your good cargo in a deteriorating Soviet-era vessel registered in Panama. On September 1, 2004, Hurricane Francis, Category 4 at landfall, hit the Turks and Caicos Islands. At the time, the La Famille Express was anchored unmanned in the South Dock area of Providenciales. There was no crew aboard to monitor the moorings or respond to the conditions. When the extreme hurricane winds arrived, the vessel tore free. The ship dragged its anchor across the Caicos Banks for almost 12 miles, 19 kilometers. The anchor was massive enough to slow it down but not stop it. The ship crossed miles of shallow sandbank before grounding on a shoal approximately 2.3 miles off Long Bay Beach in a few feet of water. The detached anchor, which it had dragged the entire distance, is still visible on the seafloor near where the ship stopped. No salvage attempt was made. The vessel was abandoned. Looters arrived and stripped everything of value, all the machinery, all the brass fittings, anything portable. What remained was a rusted steel hull sitting upright on a Caribbean sandbank, listing heavily, in water shallow enough to stand in, visible from the shore. It is now a tourist attraction. Commercial jet ski tours bring visitors to the site. People climb the rusting superstructure and jump from heights of up to 25 feet into the shallow water below. The contrast of the orange-brown rust against the turquoise of the Caicos Banks is genuinely striking. Photographically, it works. What the photographs do not convey is the state of the structure they are climbing. Environmental and archaeological assessments of the La Famille Express describe it as highly hazardous. The deck and hull plates are compromised by severe rust holes that can open without warning. The interior contains lead-based marine paints in an advanced state of deterioration. Breathing the dust constitutes a direct lead exposure risk. There is deteriorating asbestos insulation throughout. Residual petroleum products. Sharp rusted metal shards on every accessible surface. Broken glass, jagged metal debris has broken off the hull during subsequent tropical storms and now lies scattered in the surrounding shallow water, hazardous to boats and swimmers. Local authorities have issued strict warnings against boarding the vessel. People board it anyway. Why is the La Famille Express still there? The ownership question is complicated. A Panamanian registered vessel abandoned in a British overseas territory after being dragged off its moorings by a hurricane. The cost of removing a deteriorating steel hulk from a shallow Caribbean reef requires cutting it apart in situ and hauling the sections away. No party with the legal authority and financial motivation to do so has materialized. The wreck is too far gone to have salvage value. The steel is too corroded to be worth recovering, and the tour operators are still running trips to it. So it sits, rusting, slowly shedding metal into the water around it. A Soviet Cold War vessel that dragged itself across a Caribbean sandbank and is now a jet ski destination. That is the La Famille Express. That is where it ended up. 6 wrecks. 6 answers. The SS Point Reyes stayed because photographers blocked its removal, then burned it down, and no one has gotten around to cleaning up what remains. The Sweepstakes stayed because cold freshwater preserved it perfectly for 140 years, and a national marine park protects it. The SS Sapona stayed because its owner went bankrupt in a hurricane. The US military bombed the hull for target practice, and the Caribbean spent a century finishing what the bombing started. The city of Adelaide stayed because mangrove trees grew inside it, and it became an island. The USS Cairo was recovered, cut into 3 sections by the salvage cables, reassembled on a concrete foundation in a national park, and it is still here because the river mud gave it back changed. The La Famille Express was dragged across a sandbank by a hurricane in 2004, and nobody has been sufficiently motivated to deal with it since. What runs through all 6 stories is not depth or distance. None of these wrecks are remote. None of them require specialized technology to reach. What keeps them there is something more varied and more human. Bureaucratic inertia, legal complexity, ecological transformation, economic calculation, and the persistent gap between the scale of the problem and the available motivation to solve it. The most expensive thing to remove is something that has been there long enough to stop looking like a problem. The SS Point Reyes burned while someone watched on social media. The Sweepstakes has had structural braces installed by a national park authority that actively manages its decay. The Sapona hosted the last flight of a training squadron that vanished over the Atlantic. The city of Adelaide grew trees. The Yazoo River kept the Cairo for a century, and then gave it back, damaged by the effort of getting it out. The La Famille Express is a jet ski destination. Shallow water. All of them. Visible. Reachable. Exactly where they always were. If you made it to the end of this one, the Sweepstakes is my personal favorite on this list, and I would genuinely like to know which wreck caught your attention most. Drop it in the comments. More shipwreck history coming. Subscribe if you want it when it lands.